Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Irvin, the managing editor of Washington Examiner, and I'm once again joined by Sarah Bedford, our investigations editor, and Kaylin Deese, our Department of Justice reporter. We are talking yet again about the Autopen investigation. It's our latest Autopen update. This is our third roundtable. If you want to go and catch up with what we've talked about before, you can find our previous two installments on our Washington Examiner's YouTube channel. But we're pairing it back today. It's just the three of us. And since we last filmed one of these, there's been quite a lot of movement. Um, Perhaps less so from the actual investigation itself, although we will be getting into that a little bit and the latest goings on there. But there's been a couple of interesting articles that have dropped in the last few days, not least the New York Times and an interview with former President Biden himself. But perhaps, Sarah, I could come to you first, and if you could maybe give us the Autopen investigation for Dummies Cliff Notes on what's kind of happened in the last few days.
Sure. I think that New York Times interview is the most important development because it shed some light that the Oversight Committee has so far not been able to get on how the process worked in terms of approving the use of the Autopen, who was actually operating the Autopen at that time, and how the decisions were made, or how Biden claimed the decisions were made regarding those controversial last-minute pardons. But I don't think that the New York Times report and Biden's explanation of how this worked actually exonerates him or his aides. In fact, what came out in that New York Times article supports the Republican narrative about the Autopen, which is that Biden was not personally approving every decision, which is that he wasn't directly relaying his approval of the Autopen to the person who would actually end up using the device to apply a signature. In fact, the New York Times article suggests there were three layers of aides who were sort of playing telephone that, we promised Biden really said yes to this in a private meeting, just trust us, for her to use the auto pen. And so this really has all the hallmarks of the Team Biden sort of soft launching the types of things that may end up coming out of the DOJ investigation and what's going on Capitol Hill.
I think one of the most remarkable bits in that article for me was they had obtained an email from White House Chief of Staff Jeff Zients with a reply all saying, I approve the use of the Autopen for the execution of all these following pardons. And okay, the Chief of Staff carries out a lot of the duties of the president is kind of baked into the title, the Chief of Staff. But that to me struck me as a pretty extraordinary uh, revelation, and it was kind of glossed over. I mean, am I off base there?
No, I think it absolutely is a major revelation that again does support what Democrats are dismissing as conspiracy theories about the use of the auto pen. You have someone who is not the president putting in writing that they approved the use of this device. And even when Biden is put out there deliberately to defend this, he acknowledges that he wasn't the one making these controversial pardon decisions. There were some episodes that the New York Times reporters got into with Biden that included Biden on one day saying he was going to pardon somebody and then rescinding the pardon the next day. And Biden tried to say that, that was the result of my own careful reflections. That's why I reversed it 24 hours later. A lot of what he was saying didn't make sense. It wasn't internally consistent because he's saying he made the decisions and then acknowledging that he didn't. But also, if you actually went and read the transcript or the excerpts of the transcript that the reporters released, he also didn't make sense just like from an English speaker perspective. You could tell that the decline was still there because he was barely piecing together sentences.
Right, right. Um, we'll get back to the House Oversight investigation in a minute, but I think one thing, Kaylin, you'd said off camera that you were particularly interested about was how did the House Oversight Committee almost kind of get outflanked a little bit here by the New York Times? But the New York Times had obtained emails from the Biden administration. I presume they've been released by the National Archives, but the Times it seems to have got some of these, whether it's come from somebody at the archives or maybe someone in Biden's staff. But do you think the House Oversight was perhaps maybe caught a bit flat-footed here, or do you think they already had them and we're just kind of seeing this kind of play out in public?
Well, it's a great question. And I do think that the House Oversight Committee was caught a little bit flat-footed. That's based off of some of my own conversations that I've been having with people familiar with the matter, but also on account that the Senate Investigative Committee has already this week sought some of these records, these emails that were referenced in the Times report. So the fact that, we know that there's essentially multiple investigations going on. There's Senate is basically looking into more of the cognitive decline elements. But that Senate Investigative Committee is pursuing those records. The reason why it's important for the Senate to get those records is because under the PRA, all of these emails and things that the Times got their hands on, they couldn't have done that on their own just by filing a normal Freedom of Information Act request, because all of those items are privileged 5 year until 5 years after the administration's concluded. So we're still in that time bracket where you just members of the public can't get access to those things, but Congress, courts, and of course the executive branch can look into those things. So definitely there had to have been some third party help for the New York Times to get those. And even though the Oversight Committee didn't seem to have access to those, it does seem like Republicans investigating the matter are on their way to getting more of those emails. So it definitely was, I would say, a bit of a, sort of a, catching, everyone off guard because no one, I don't think expected, especially with all the access that the House Oversight Committee has had to many of these Biden aides, expected maybe the New York Times to get sort of the one up on them, so to speak.
Right, right. And I think to Sarah's point, it does seem to be a soft launch from the other from the Biden side on kind of nothing to see here. This was all done perfectly by the books. Sarah, one name that popped up in the New York Times article that hadn't been on our radar before, as far as the Biden aides go, was Stephanie Feldman. Could you just explain a little bit about how she fits into things here?
Stephanie Feldman was the staff secretary for the back half of Biden's presidency. We know that Neera Tanden, who is the only aide to have cooperated with the House Oversight investigation so far, was the staff secretary for the first part of Biden's presidency. And that part is of less interest to investigators because Biden's cognitive decline wasn't as dramatic during then. So there's not as many suspicions that perhaps aides were usurping his power behind his back or without his ability to understand. Stephanie Feldman, though, is not really the big fish that House Oversight or the Justice Department would be going after because there's no implication so far that she was the one making decisions. She was just actually operating the pen herself and her office was doing that. So she is a player in this whole situation, but the people that House Oversight Committee are going to be most interested in are people like Bruce Reed, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, who was really close to Biden, Steve Ricchetti, Mike Donnellan, these people who are occupying really, really high level positions and had also worked with Biden for decades. So they had that sort of loyalty that some people who were newcomers in Biden's orbit wouldn't have had. Now, Stephanie Feldman is someone who'd been with Biden for quite a long time. She goes back to the Obama administration, where she worked in his vice presidential office, but she's not the person who's being accused of making decisions in Biden's name. Even the New York Times report acknowledges that it was people like Bruce Reed who were the ones who supposedly heard the yes from Biden in these meetings and relayed it to Stephanie Feldman.
Yeah, you got it, boss. Um, okay, well, I think why don't we go back to the state of the investigation and where we're at and who we have heard or maybe perhaps not heard from, even if we physically seen them. I think last time we spoke, we were still waiting on Kevin O'Connor, Biden's physician, to testify. Subsequently, we have seen Anthony Bernal come and go rather quickly. And then, as of this recording, we're waiting on Annie Tomasini to appear. And I wonder if Kaylin, you can maybe give us just a reminder of Bernal, why we think he's an interesting player here. How does he fit in, and what he ended up doing on Wednesday? Because we really didn't glean a lot of information from him or any.
Right. What we saw happening from Anthony Bernal's appearance was very reminiscent to what we saw from Dr. Kevin O'Connor, a lot of pleading the fifth, and even a video release that the committee had afterwards. Now, Anthony Bernal, he's a longtime senior advisor and aide to First Lady Jill Biden. If you ask Comr, you'll get the phrase work wife thrown around, or work husband. And so, what basically Bernal has been described essentially in books, especially the recent one that just came out, Original Sin with Jake Tapper, as sort of the gatekeeper, the surrogate voice for the First Lady, and someone who, was sitting in on high level meetings, coordinating policy, scheduling decisions that, sort of touch, basically across many, close corridors of the White House. So, what was interesting to me to see somebody like Bernal exhibit a similar pattern to Kevin O'Connor is that it marks another one of these, shutters of the door for the committee to get information from someone that is of key interest by the investigators. Now, that might seem, at first as a blow to their efforts to get more information, but what's happening in the background is that this is also helping to inform the Justice Department, which is also having its separate probe over this matter, on who these players are in this list of former aides and subjects who are really keeping sort of a tight lip over everything that the investigators are asking them. That's sort of helping to create sort of some glowing nature around these figures who are just not saying anything because perhaps further down the line there could be a grand jury a subpoena that might be able to compel them to say more. So from what I've, gathered, the committee investigators aren't, disappointed when they see someone, plead the fifth like this. They're kind of just, more so, moving on to the next person. And Tomasini, what happened with her was, she was going to voluntarily comply, but now there's going to be a subpoena out for her as well. She was supposed to come before the committee on Friday, July 18th. And that doesn't seem like it's going to happen anymore. So that would sort of mark the third subpoena that would have to happen in this oversight investigation. And perhaps, we don't know what's going to happen, but, it wouldn't surprise me if there were more figures, perhaps her, that we could see similar pleadings of the fifth.
Sarah, the pleading the fifth scenario is, I'm assuming, rather quite frustrating for House Oversight. Although I'd imagine that they knew that this would be a particular issue. Like, are there any other tactics that Oversight could use in order to kind of glean information, or are they sort of in a timeout while the Justice Department has their own investigation?
One tactic that you hear increasingly frequently is the idea of the committee extending immunity to one or more of these aides, which would take away their incentive, their ability to plead the fifth, because they wouldn't have no risk of incriminating themselves. But that takes a two-thirds vote on the committee. So it's not likely that they're going to get any Democrats that go along with it. However, some conservatives are saying the committee should move towards immunity anyway, force these Democrats to vote against transparency, to vote against finding out what happened when
Right.
polls show the majority of Americans do suspect there was a cover up here. I mean, there was very obviously a cover up of the mental decline, right? Did that cross lines into something criminal, or was it simply unethical? That's sort of what the committee and the Justice Department are trying to get to the bottom of. But public sentiment is on the Republican side here. So you may see some votes on immunity. People they're trying to get, again, they don't care about Dr. Kevin O'Connor and sending him to jail. They're trying to get to the root of who was allegedly abusing executive power. It certainly wasn't Biden's doctor or Jill Biden's aide, but they were potentially enabling that sort of thing to happen. And I will just make one more point about Anthony Bernal. Yesterday, he showed up on Capitol Hill with a very, very high-powered lawyer, Jonathan Sue, who was deputy White House counsel under Biden. He was said to have played a role in the start of the Jack Smith investigations at the Justice Department. He's a huge fish. And I think the fact that Anthony Bernal did show up with a lawyer that powerful shows that he's a very valuable witness and that potentially the Biden family could be quite worried about the things that he knows.
Right, right. Um, I just want to circle back to a second news story that appeared this week that was again clearly designed as a sort of gotcha moment, nothing to see here. And it was NBC News released this story that James Comer, the congressman who's in charge of the House Oversight Committee, and this investigation, had signed documents with a digital signature. They were basically kind of trying to compare that to saying, well, Comer does it as well, so this can't possibly be an issue. And Comer, for his part, and I think quite correctly so, pushed back on that and said there's a clear difference between the authorized use of a digital signature on, being used on Adobe Acrobat instead of the unauthorized use of the Autopen for executive action. And I think NBC and the Biden camp most likely this is kind of attempt at gotcha journalism. Underlined a massive point for me, which is that the investigation isn't necessarily about the auto pen, and I think I'll be probably repeating myself here when I say that the auto pen is literally the shiny object that people are getting distracted by. And it's more about who was controlling it and who was controlling access to Biden and influencing Biden and whether he was aware of what was going on. Kaylin, what did you make of that article and any kind of subsequent fallout from that?
Well, aside from it being a misleading comparison, I think that you have a great point that anyone who might have been confused about what the Autopin investigation is about, this article exemplifies what it is and what it isn't, because Comer himself even pointed out the issue isn't the mere use of mechanical signatures. It's whether the person supposedly authorizing the act actually reviewed and approved it. And that's the whole issue in this Biden investigation. It's probing whether he had awareness of what he was signing at all or giving approval for these automated signatures, and particularly when it came to these mass clemency issues, which we do know now from the New York Times was essentially a criteria list that Biden scanned the criteria that would be used to apply to these clemencies, but didn't necessarily know any of the names that were going to be applied to it. Just looked at the sheet and he's like, "Oh yeah, that criteria looks pretty good," and then let the other people, sort of do the work for him. So I think that that sort of underscores. I mean, this NBC report. I don't know. We can assume what the point of it was to maybe potentially undermine what this investigation is supposed to be for. Maybe try to make Comer look like he's a bit of a hypocrite. But anyone, everyone uses digital PDF signing. I mean, I think people use those on a daily basis. But when you're doing that, you yourself are attaching your signature. Sometimes it's something that you've already written yourself to the document. And it's not like Biden was going on a computer and attaching his digital signature to all of these things remotely. So I think that, as silly as it might be, it might have actually given people a broader perspective whenever they have to face Comer's rebuttal that, this isn't just about the shiny object as you were referring to.
Yeah, I think, in Comer's case, there's no questions about his mental ability. Like Comer can climb a flight of stairs without help and get through a sentence that you can understand. So it's from a cognitive perspective, not the same, but I also think there's a really, really important distinction that gets lost in the Autopen conversation, which is that there are certain powers that the president alone has, thanks to the Constitution, things that no member of Congress can do, no cabinet secretary can do, only the president. And he can do those things only by applying his signature to a document. So the Autopen was used on a bunch of different documents throughout the Biden administration, right? It was used on proclamations, letters, that sort of thing. And we're not talking about those because those were not core exercises of presidential power. We're talking about the pardons because Biden is the only person in the country with that authority. And if an aide was exercising that using the Autopen, that's in a totally different class than aides putting out press statements or tweets that Biden didn't fully know about because he was napping. That is a much greater alleged constitutional violation. And so to point out that Comer was using this automated signature device for letters, even if his aides were doing it without him knowing. That would not cross any constitutional bounds. It wouldn't necessarily cross any legal bounds. The distinction is because we're talking about acts of clemency here.
Right, right. Um, I think one thing I'd like to just mention as well, and is the New York Times article for me kind of painted this picture. We're talking about cognitive decline, and I think it's very easy to think that cognitive decline is like one day the lights are on, the next day the lights are off, and that's it. But it's not linear. There are good days and there are bad days, and I'd imagine that would be the case for Joe Biden. And we all saw what happened when he had a bad day. It was the Trump debate night. That's what kind of started all this, and it's been a more than a year of this. Uh, what I'd be curious to know, amidst all of this, that how did the staff manage when Biden was having a bad day compared to a good day? Because I don't doubt that Biden was switched on when he was being asked stuff about getting a pardon for General Milley. Like that's clearly comes across in the New York Times article. But to your point, you talk about he doesn't know the list of the names that are there, and oh, we just don't want to bother the boss with the details on that one. But I think that's kind of what it boils down to for me. Like, how did they navigate that on a bad day when he was having a bad day, if he was? I don't know if you've got any kind of further thoughts on that, Sarah.
Right. I mean, we don't know because of the extent of the cover-up whether the debate was in fact a bad day. There's every reason to believe that might have been a good day. His aides maximized his chances of performing well at the debate. They gave him a ton of rest beforehand. They did an insane amount of prep. I mean, clearing 10 days on a president's schedule just to prepare for a debate for a politician who has been doing debates for his entire political career is crazy when you think about it. The busiest, most important man in the entire world needed 10 days to prepare for something that he'd done dozens and dozens of times. So there was every reason for them to believe that he would perform well. And for all we know, that was a great performance from Joe. So these questions about how far and how dramatic the decline really was behind closed doors are important because if Joe Biden on his best day under the best of circumstances in a debate format that he negotiated was that addled and clearly unable to follow what was going on an actual bad day, how is he making decisions in the Situation Room, guarding against, national security concerns and giving his authorization for things like these acts of clemency? That's those are a series of really important questions that these aides who are protecting him obviously don't want answered, and it raises the suspicion level even further.
Kaylin, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, but
Mhm.
I'm I am of the opinion that whenever Joe Biden sticks his head up over the parapet again, it doesn't make things better. And that's just him generally, whether it be Autopen or moving on from the election. Whenever he seems to go public with something in the last sort of 6 months, it doesn't have the intended effect. I'm curious if you think we might not hear from him for a little while, and if his what remains of his team maybe buttons him up even more.
Yeah, I think that the fact that he's gone on a couple of different interviews that got largely overlooked. He did this long sit down with the BBC that some people paid attention to, but if you really watch that interview, this cough that he had throughout much of his presidency is still lingering
Hmm.
on, it sort of just underscores the fact that we know that he is battling cancer right now, which is also a bit of a thorn to this effort to hold him accountable and his team accountable for any things that they might have, done that, basically was, puppeteering a president around. I mean, there is something distinctly sad about, the fact that, he's facing that type of, disease. But at the same time, we didn't learn about this until after he was president. So there is also, kind of that feeling of like, it's like a relative or a family member who that held out on you for, a long time about some sort of like deathly illness that they had. You would have preferred to know that information long before, they decided to tell you. And I think that that's sort of the sentiment that a lot of the country has about Joe Biden, even Democrats. You can't really seem to find a lot of Joe Biden fans after his presidency.
Mm.
And I think that that sort of underscores where we're at. People just want to know what happened. And, it was very surprising that he gave the New York Times a 10-minute phone call. The fact that he wanted to come out and sort of get out in front of this, but not really, do a good job at it too. Maybe we won't hear that much coming from him anymore. Maybe we'll hear more of his staff, starting to speak up. I know that, I've had conversations with his office of the former president, and they're willing to talk, but they're also kind of doing a lot of damage control at the same time, trying to make clarifications on things that really don't matter too much. So it's tough. We'll see what happens if Mr. Biden now decides to come back up and say some words again.
Right. I guess I'm just curious, as this is developing and this ongoing investigation, where do we go from here? Are we expecting anything uh aside from aides refusing to testify? What can we see something on the horizon? Anything that you're eyeing up, Sarah?
I think it's very likely that the Justice Department investigation moves more quickly than the congressional investigation. They have more coercive tools at their disposal. Their subpoenas carry greater force than congressional subpoenas. I mean, the Congress needs the DOJ to enforce their subpoenas. DOJ's subpoenas are self-executing in that way. So they have a lot more tools at their disposal to get to the bottom of this. And you're seeing everybody plead the fifth, even though it's a bad look, even though they know those clips are going to get released on Twitter and provide fodder for all of their critics, because there are people who potentially have real criminal exposure here. We don't know the extent of that. This is sort of an unprecedented situation. But keep in mind that these are people who were just a few months away from trying to put this man in office for 4 more years, knowing his limitations, knowing that he wasn't capable of making real sound decisions at that point, something that virtually everyone around him has acknowledged since then. They were still willing to put him in office for a second term and desperately trying to cover that up, even though he was going to need a wheelchair to get around after the election and was, had this cancer was obviously there. It's very likely doctors have said that his physicians were aware of that because it's not a type of cancer that just sneaks up. And presidents are typically tested for the antigen that signifies the cancer. But knowing all of this, these are people who were clinging to power so desperately that they were still trying to put him in the presidency. And there are just so many questions worth asking that the Justice Department is doing right now.
Well, I think we should probably leave it there. And we shall just keep tabs on things, I suppose, as it goes. But in the meantime, thank you both for joining me. Always a pleasure to talk all things Autopen with both of you. And until next time, we'll see you later.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.